At Royal Purple, we develop synthetic lubricants that outperform.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our second webinar. Today, as you can see from our title, we'll be looking at restrictive covenants. So first of all, we'll be going through the background and context for the webinar. Essentially, what motivated this webinar is essentially a desire to have a greater understanding of how it is laws with respect to restrictive covenants and developments actually shape, how they actually shape or influence developments in Jamaica and what it is that we're actually seeing in our day-to-day and underground reality. Truth be told is that while we were actually coming up or conceptualizing this webinar, we came to the realization that many of the laws that basically governs these items, they are rooted in colonial history. They were created during the colonial era. And even where it is, there are laws in the legal framework that were developed in the post-colonial era. We're seeing similar characteristics to those that were developed in the colonial era. So with that in mind, the question that we have to ask ourselves is whether or not these post-colonial legislations, which have features and characteristics of colonial legislations, if the outcomes from them really depart from their colonial roots. We often see at the same time that there is wide-scale transformation of agricultural lands to residential use. We're seeing a vast number of high-rise developments. And we're seeing in the newspapers, news articles, as well as in news reports, that we have residents, persons from all walks of life, that are complaining about how our rural or urban or suburban landscapes are basically shaping up in the 21st century. Now, if it is that we're having challenges in this regard, another logical question that we also have to ask is, how can these colonial era legislations or legislations with colonial era characteristics, how can they help us to achieve sustainable development if it is even at all possible? And so our webinar will today, first of all, take us through things that are in the law, that aren't in the law, that probably perhaps some of us might think should be addressed in law. And it will then take us to a point where we will be discussing planning practice. And thereafter, we'll be going into how it is, what it is we have equips us to achieve sustainable development. So at this point in time, I'll also like to bring to your attention what are our objectives in a First, we're trying to look at the relationship between four legislations, namely the Local Improvements Act, the Restrictive Covenants Modification and Charges Act, the Registration of Strata Titles Act, and our principal planning legislation, which is the Town and Country Planning Act. Thereafter, we're trying to examine or investigate, explore how it is these legislations actually shape planning practice. And thereafter, we're going to raise the level of the discourse to theory for us to then look into whether it is or how well we can, with these legislations and planning practice that currently exists, actually achieve sustainable development in an indigenous way, in a manner which is actually unique to Jamaica, taking into consideration our local realities. At this point in time, I'll introduce you to our code of conduct for our participants. So each of you will notice that your mics are muted, your cameras are off. And it's intentional so that the focus will be on our speakers and what is being shown on the screen and what it is that they're trying to bring across to us. Now, if it is you're having a challenge at any point in time, our tech team will actually try to assist you, but their primary focus will be assisting our panelists and speakers so that the webinar continues smoothly. And as soon as possible, they'll get to your technical needs. This webinar is being recorded. It's actually being streamed live on YouTube right now. So in the event that there are persons who cannot be admitted, then persons can essentially just join the webinar and view it via YouTube. Next for me, please. There is a live captioning feature as well. So, and you'll see it at the bottom of your screen. So essentially, you do have the option to essentially read what is being said. At various points in time throughout our webinars, we will be taking screenshots. And if it is you would prefer for your screens not to be included in any of our materials that we'll be creating from these screenshots, we ask that you send us an email at alev_jamaica@hotmail.com. We also ask that our attendees be present and engaged in today's session. And at the end, you'll be asked to complete a poll, and we're encouraging all individuals to give us this feedback so that we'll be able to improve as we go forward with providing you with more critical and enriching material. We also ask that all attendees are respectful to each other, and it therefore means that we have to be cognizant of the type of language and information that we share in the chat. As per usual, there'll be a question and answer session at the end of the roundtable discussion, and persons, attendees are basically encouraged to pose their questions in the chat as they appear or as they come to them, so that we'll be able to compile them and have all questions addressed in the Q&A section. In addition to that, we'll also like to highlight that in the email that you received with your registration link for the webinar, you'll also see a link to files which has information such as the conceptual underpinning of the webinar and information on our speakers, as well as learning materials with respect to the webinar. This information will be made available or can be accessed up to 5 days after today's event. At this time, I have the honor of introducing our moderators. So this time around, our moderators are actually students. A former student, Mrs. Candice O'Brien, from the BSc Land Economy and Valuation Surveying Program, and a current student of the real estate program, Mr. Sadiki Hines. So in brief, just to introduce Candice to you. As I mentioned previously, Candice is a past student, a recent graduate of the BSc Land Economy and Valuation Surveying Program. She has recently become Mrs. Candice O'Brien. Congratulations, Candice. She, since completing her degree, she has moved on to pursue a Master of Business Administration in Construction and Real Estate Management at the University College of Estate Management in the UK. Candice has a passion for real estate finance, as well as real estate development. She was essentially a real estate baby, as her entire family are a part of the real estate industry, in particular the valuation sector. And so Candice brings to the table her passion for finance, development, as well as her basically drive to want to see national development take place in Jamaica. We next move on to Mr. Sadiki Hines. He's a third-year student in the BSc Real Estate Management and Valuation Program at UTech. Sadiki, in my interactions with him, I've come to see that he has a passion for social justice. He brings to the table a critical mind. He has a strong background in economics management, and through doing his degree now at the University of Technology, he's basically coupling those skills which tie in well with valuation. And I would say that he's in pursuance of trying to also ensure that Jamaica has a brighter future, so that he can play a critical role in the development and upliftment of the nation. Sadiki, many persons might not be aware, but Sadiki also represents Jamaica nationally in the sports of table tennis. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Mrs. O'Brien and to Mr. Sadiki Hines so that they can introduce you to our panelists.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you Dr. Tina Beale, for the introduction. And we just want to extend as well our welcome to another Alev's webinar. Both Sadiki and I were very happy to be here assisting in this capacity, and we're looking forward to a very informative and exciting discussion. Sadiki?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Really glad to be here. So this time I'll be introducing the panelists. Our great minds for today's discussion are Dr. Earl Bailey, Ms. Denise Thompson, and Mr. Winston Senior, attorneys at law. Dr. Bailey is a senior lecturer of the Real Estate and Planning Department at the University of Technology in Jamaica. He is in his 28th year as an academic at the University of Technology, and he has over 10 years as an adjunct lecturer at the University of West Indies, Mona. His general areas cover urban and regional planning and land resources management, with a special emphasis on housing, spatial planning, heritage, disaster management, environmental planning and management, construction, climate change, planning policy, development, plan making, and management and land development. Dr. Bailey spearheaded the accreditation of the Bachelors in Urban and Regional Planning as a first and second program within the University of Technology to be accredited by the University Council of Jamaica in 2003 and 2008 respectively. His engagement with the government of Jamaica saw him involved in the preparation of the National Housing Policy and Implementation Plan in 2008, the National Squatter Report of 2004, and the template for the consolidation of the technical services of the Housing Agency of Jamaica and Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation. While president of the Jamaica Institute of Planners in 2003, he chartered the framework legislation for planners to be a formal part of the development process. He is currently vice president of the Jamaica Institute of Planners, and his mantra is thinking aloud.
Okay. So Mr. Winston Senior, attorney at law, has over 15 years experience in residential and commercial real estate. He's a well-established attorney at law with a track record of providing quality service while guiding clients in achieving results and workable solutions in areas of business and commercial law, family law, and real estate. He will be the first to tell you that his passion for land matters has caused him to focus his law practice primarily on the purchase and sale of properties, residential and commercial leases, modifications of restrictive covenants, and estate planning. Mr. Senior sits as a representative on the board of the Faculty of Law at the University of Technology, Jamaica, and is a member of the Jamaica Bar Association. Ms. Denise Thomas is an attorney at law who practices in the real estate conveyancing, estate planning, administration of, Ms. Denise Thomas is an attorney at law who practices in the area of real estate conveyancing. She was admitted to the Jamaica Bar in 2014 after completing her studies with the University of Huddersfield, England, where she received her Bachelor's of Law degree with honors, and with the Norman Manley Law School, where she received her legal education certificate. Having worked in the legal field for over 15 years in a different capacity, she has gained significant knowledge and experience in the sale and purchase of real estate. Her practice spans a wide range of land-related matters, which includes application to modify restrictive covenants and application to register land. Her practice also entails matters involving estate planning and the administration of the estate of deceased persons, which include obtaining grants of probate and grants of administration. Ms. Thomas is also a member of the Jamaica Bar Association. So let's just get right into our discussion. To fully understand the logic guiding the first question, an awareness is needed of the definition of development as seen in the Town and Country Planning Act. So Section 5, subsection 4 of the Act states that development is the carrying out of building, engineering, mining, or other operations in, on, over, or on the land, or the making of any material change in the use of any buildings or other lands. The next slide, please. Here we can see some activities that are not considered development, such as the use of land for agriculture or forestry. Section 3 of the Local Improvement Act indicates that the subdivision of agricultural land is not governed by the Act, which seems logical considering that to develop agricultural land, the restrictive covenants must be modified or discharged. Specifically in St. Catherine, over the past 25 to 30 years, we have seen a wide-scale conversion of agricultural land to residential land. So Dr. Bailey, from the legal planning and developer's perspective, could you explain the process by which agricultural lands are converted to residential use?
We're not hearing you, Dr. Bailey.
Are you hearing me now? Good afternoon.
Yes, we're hearing you now.
Okay. Good. Well, the process falls within the ambits of NEPA and the local authorities involved, where the land is located. There is first application has to be made to NEPA or the local authority for a proposed development. It could be housing, commercial space on that land, and then now the application will be followed with a project report that detailedly explain the reason for the request for converting the land to agricultural purposes, giving some metrics of the amount of land to be converted. I'm not sure that the authority will approve total conversion. Some lands must remain on agricultural use. Those plans are submitted to the local authority along with the project document detailing the rationale for the request for land conversion. The authority then submits to NEPA's Special Planning Division, Local Planning Area Branch, and it goes through NEPA's internal processes, goes to the planning committees. If there are anything that needs to be clarified, but even before it reaches NEPA, the authority may have concern. They may request from the developer other information that may to clarify certain issues regarding the intended development. When all those satisfied, goes to NEPA. NEPA goes through its internal approval, monitoring process. Sorry, it's a case where the plan may require an EIA, for example. If an EIA is required, the project proponent is requested to do an EIA. NEPA furnishes that person with the term of references for the EIA. They in turn respond to NEPA's term of references with their own term of references. The EIA is done. It is submitted along with the project documents. The EIA goes through NEPA's internal monitoring processes. If the EIA is approved and the development is approved, then the person gets their approval process, and they go ahead with the project. Of course, NEPA and the local authority provides monitoring of the project at different stages. If the EIA is not required, it goes straight to approval or denial. Of course, NEPA has to give the developer reasons for the denial. If the EIA report is not, if the EIA report does not support the development, sorry, the developer will have the right under the NRCA Act to apply to the minister, to appeal to the minister for reconsideration. And this is where I think there is a flaw in the process, because I think that in a liberal democracy, there should be no space for any single person to make a decision on a national or regional or local issue. I think democratic characteristics should include at least a meeting of minds, more than one person, to address this sort of issues. That's basically the process in a simplified nutshell. Of course, I've mentioned the need to get the Minister of Agriculture involved, because the person in justifying the need for the change, issues such as food security will come into place. Alternative use of the land for other productive uses. But the fact is that the way in which we have defined within a cultural and social context agriculture in Jamaica, it is always seen as farming. So we get that image of a water boot, machete, straw hat, donkey, right? But when you go into things like digital agriculture or precision agriculture, where the focus is more on improving yield on less land than expanding yield on more land. So for example, if the aim is to just improve the amount of production from less land than we normally would, and that means a whole revamping of our agricultural sector to include less land being brought under cultivation. I'm not sure how the whole issue of subdivision is handled with agricultural lands. I know how it is handled legally, but at the conceptual basis, when you look at land use, where land could be used for agriculture, for commercial, residential, industrial, I'm not seeing why the same land use concept cannot be applied to agricultural lands, where agricultural use could be pasture, it could be grazing, it could be banana, food production, that kind of thing. So it's a whole lot of things are involved in the process. Just in a nutshell, that is.
All right, thank you, Dr. Bailey. Mr. Senior, according to subsection 5, subsection 4 of the Local Improvements Act, the definition of subdivide is broad because it goes beyond simply the division of land into smaller units and also entails the erection of more than one building on land, even if the land has not been divided into smaller units. However, at the same time, the definition of development in the Town and Country Planning Act indicates that development does not include buildings or other land which are used for the purpose of any use class specified in a development order for a locality. If, for example, an individual owns a plot of land zoned for residential use, they live on it and have built other houses on it that are being occupied by other persons, but the land was not divided into smaller units. Should that person have applied to the local authority for approval prior to erecting the additional buildings, even though technically what they have done is not development within the context of the Town and Country Planning Act? Your mic is muted, Mr. Senior.
Thank you, Mr. Hines. That's a very interesting question. I think my answer would have been possibly different. I went to the country area recently, and I can no longer see my neighbor's house because another neighbor has erected their property in such a manner that the other neighbor has been blocked out. It's quite an interesting concept. But listen, Section 5, subsection 2 of the Act, in essence, says that if you have a building or you have land which is being used in a particular way, then if you were to have another building or land being used in a similar way, then there isn't the need under the Act or under that particular section to make that application. I don't believe, though, that the matter starts and ends there, because certainly if you have restrictive covenants, you may have, for example, a restrictive covenant that says not more than one building should be on that particular plot of land or on that lot. Then certainly in that regard, I believe that there's no escaping it, you'd have to make an application for that to be modified.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Sina.
Thank you, Mr. Sina, for your answer. Okay, so the next two questions speak to subdivision in the informal aspect of the land market. So just for clarification for our viewers, informality here does not speak to whether the property is registered or unregistered, but rather if the individual's land tenure rights are formal or informal. So essentially, there can be formal and informal tenure rights on both registered and unregistered lands. Our question to the panelists, following up on question 2, right? In rural Jamaica, or what a lot of us might call the country areas, there's a high level of informal subdivisions and informal land tenure. Is a broad definition of laying out and subdivision of land seen in Section 4 of the Local Improvement Act, the legislator's way of governing the erection of buildings on all lands, whether it's formal or informal?
If I may commence the discussion regarding this question. This question has to be looked at with historical significance. We have to understand the historical dynamics in which land ownership commenced in post-emancipation Jamaica, so to speak, post-emancipation and post-independence Jamaica. The fact is that persons who now own lands, the persons who came from the cane field as slaves, well, as free people. Post-emancipation, there was no formal process to bequeath these persons' lands. All right. So post-emancipation, all lands that were owned by the freed people was considered informally owned. So that has been the crucible of spatial informality in Jamaica. Those persons, we have persons in that category who are still not able to acquire land from 1844 until now. So the process of informality is not a contemporary issue. It is entrenched in our sociocultural DNA, to the point where the laws that were promulgated pre and post emancipation did not consider the need for land ownership of the free people post emancipation. And the laws still, to this very day, favored the persons who own the lands, well, who took the lands from the Tainos, because those persons didn't understand or respect the tenure structure of the Tainos. So those lands were basically stolen from the Tainos, and then now the thieves of those lands basically created a law that barred other persons from owning land that they stole. And so we are not very far removed from that system now. So I am not somebody who supports the labeling of informality as a negative thing in itself. It is evidence. It is evidence that we have not been able to address the spatial inequalities that we have inherited post emancipation and post independence. There has to be a way of us addressing those issues before we can move forward as spatially. And when I mean spatial, because I like to put things in context. When I use the word spatial or spatial planning, I make reference to the fact that there has to be a sort of law or method that governs the way in which physical investments are arranged on the land to form a functional system, right? So in that case, physical planning is the act of deciding what sort of physical assets are needed on each land use category. So for example, commercial lands will require different sort of physical investments than residential lands or industrial lands or recreational lands or spiritual lands. And therefore, when those assets are identified, spatial planning arrange them so they form a functional system. So for example, the extent to which we have traffic congestions on our roads, or is the fact that is a case where the physical elements in that space are not properly formed in a functional system, and they don't function to create proper flow of traffic. The same with flooding in all our spaces. The land use physical assets are not properly arranged to function. So informality is just evidences of our inability or failure to apply indigenous social and ecological tenets in how we do land development. It's as simple as that.
Thank you, Dr. Bailey. That was very insightful. Mr. Senior, would you like to add anything to what Dr. Bailey was saying? Oh, your mic is muted.
Thank you. Not at this time. I think Dr. Bailey has hit some critical points. Certainly the section 5.4, I think lays out sufficiently concerning the subdivision of land. I think Dr. Bailey has hit it. So not at this point, no.
All right, thank you. So, Dr. Bailey, in the case of individuals with formal land tenure rights, can whatever criteria used to determine the highest and best use of land be used to assess whether development works against the economic welfare of a locality? And what are the challenges an objector would face when trying to prove this?
That's a very, very loaded question. Just repeat it again to me one more time. My brain is so fast like yours. I feel slow down for me, please. Yes.
All right, so in the case of individuals with formal land tenure rights, can the criteria used to determine the highest—
It's not on the screen, it's not on the screen.
Can the criteria used to determine the highest and best use of land be used to assess whether development works against the economic welfare of a locality?
Look here, the highest and best use of land have to be defined in time context. So the best use for land 50 years ago may not be the best use now. And the best use for land now may not be the best use for land next 20 or 5 years. So we have to look at best use in the context of its current location in time, right? And of course, and I go back again to the legislative base of how we use land, which have not changed, right? So even though we have had a significant amount of social and economic changes, the fact that the legislations still have not changed is hampering a lot of our economic and social investments, right? So determining the best use of land may sometimes go against the legal framework within which is defined, and that creates problems. And that also drives informality, connected to the question before though.
Okay, thank you. So what are the challenges an objector would face when trying to prove this? And have there been any instances where such claims have been made?
Of course, we have the entire, right now, the entire KMA is replete with developers going high rise, some as high as seven floors with residential developments, which goes against the covenants and legislation that now governs the KMA. The fact is that, and I'm going to say this, and it's going to sound very controversial, single family dwelling is not a feature of a sustainable city. Sustainable urban development does not facilitate single family dwelling because it doesn't support proper economies of scale, for one. You can't have one person, well, 2 or 3 persons living on 5-acre land in a metropolitan space that demands multi-family dwellings. So how can maybe 200 families on 140 acres of land support a proper sewer system a proper water system, drains and all that, they can't afford it unless they're gonna fork out a lot of money to pay taxes for that, to maintain those things. So multi-family dwelling is where sustainable urbanization is going, because putting persons on smaller pieces of land, right, will now have more land available for recreational purposes and food production. It's as simple as that. If Kingston was zoned for high-rise multifamily, high-density dwellings, we wouldn't have no need to build lands on the agricultural lands in South Carolina and South St. Catherine. You can't live on. As a matter of fact, socioculturally, urban living is living on a lot, not on land. Land living is reserved for persons in rural areas. So in the country rural areas, you live on a piece of land because you have space to do other things with the land except living on the land, you plant on the land. But in an urban context, where the economic base is more towards commercial and industries, right? We take me to another point, because we need now to debunk the difference in how we perceive rural life and urban life. It shouldn't be because of differences in services. The same services we have in Kingston should be available throughout the entire country. The only difference between the two spaces should be the economic basis. So whereas in the rural areas, the economic base is significantly agricultural base and some food production, in the urban center, it's commercial and industrial base. That should be the only separation. But as far as infrastructure is concerned, it should be equal nationally.
That's a very
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bill.
Yeah. Okay. So Section 6 of the Town and Country Planning Act states that the only interested persons can object to the development order on basis that it's impractical or unnecessary, or that it's against the economic welfare of the locality. It goes on to state that an interested person is any person in whom is vested any freehold estate, and any person in whom is vested a leasehold interest of no less than 3 years. Mr. Senior, does this provision mean that persons with informal land tenure cannot object to the content of development orders, even if they infringe on their human rights?
Human rights. Well, I think if you look at Section 6 of the Act, it says every interested person, and it does go on to itemize who interested persons are under the section. I mean, it includes the local authorities, freehold and leasehold owners or holders, and also the water resources, persons entitled under the Water Resources Act. But if you look at the section carefully, it says every interested person may object and say who those interested persons are. I don't believe, though, that it says only interested persons. So under that section, it specifically itemized for you who you would have to be if you're going to object. But I'm not of the view that it closes entirely all the possibilities are. Certainly, especially in a situation where a person's human rights are being infringed upon. Because if your human rights are being infringed upon, I submit that you may have redress elsewhere.
Okay, thank you.
If I may add to that, what Mr. Senior said, may I?
Yes, you can, but briefly, please, because we're.
You know, if this provision was for somewhere in Texas, it would be very, very relevant, right? Jamaica is a small country, and this provision is what creates problems with our environment. So somebody's building a hotel on a fragile mangrove area in St. Elizabeth, and I live in St. Thomas. It's not my business. That's foolishness. Because our island ecology dictates that whatever happens anywhere on the island affects everybody. So interested persons the law will make somebody in that direct location. So if I object to a development in Westmoreland and I live in St. Thomas, I won't be considered an interested person, which is working against proper development. Because our ecology at the island level is interconnected at the intimate level. So a river in Westmoreland affects water quality in Kingston. So I think this interested person provision should not be a part of our legislation. This is for continental space, not for an island, not for a small island ecology as Jamaica.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Bailey. And we're still with you, right? This question is for you. The background of this session indicates that the Restrictive Covenant Act does not address how restrictive covenants are created. So could you just explain to us how they're created and the process it goes through to be placed on the registered title and title deed?
That's me? Or Dr. Bailey? You said you're still with whom?
Dr. Bailey.
Okay.
Oh.
Yes, Dr. Bailey.
This also pushes back into historical, into history. I mean, I recall when after emancipation, the slaves were not allowed to return to the plantation to collect their liquor belongings, whatever they are. So and they weren't given any rights to land. So the covenants were borrowed from the European continental space, again brought to an Atlantic space. Well, England is a large island, but I mean continental Europe. So the covenants were created to preserve certain social ethics, to separate the haves from the have-nots, whether on racial lines, social lines, economic lines. And so those covenants basically preserve the discretion of certain classes on how they wanted their lands to be arranged, how they wanted the lands to look, right? So that is the conceptual historical basis for covenants, right? But within contemporary Jamaica and the concerns we have now with climate change, I mean, we now have longer summers, which exposes our land cover to thinning out, so to speak, and we have shorter, more intense rainfall period. So even our ecological conditions have changed since then, right? So the fact is that if our ecological conditions have changed, right, and next year we are going to reach climate departure conditions where the abnormal climate will be the normal climate. So all the legislations and acts and codes and laws that were fashioned in the old climatic conditions cannot be relevant in the new climatic space that we are now experiencing. Those because the environment is behaving differently now than it was when these covenants were created, right? So covenants create to maintain some social and economic conditions which are no longer part of our culture. They are there to maintain certain ecological conditions which are no longer part of our spaces. I mean, even distance from water bodies, from rivers and coastlines. That has to change. It has to change.
So the next question.
But coming from that historical conceptual basis, the legal basis is that when lands are subdivided, when lands are surveyed, the local authorities, NEPA, the Ministry for Land and surveyors and planners and everybody, they come together and they decide what sort of covenants, what sort of guidelines, I'm not going to use the word restriction, what kind of guidelines should we put on these lands to ensure that they maintain their social sanctity or whatever sanctity they want to maintain in those groups of land in that particular space. That's how they are created, basically.
Okay, thank you so much for that answer. Ms. Thomas, could you explain to us how restrictive covenants are modified or discharged and the standard that is used to determine this? And also, if possible, for further clarification, maybe you could just take us through a simple modification process. Ms. Thomas?
Good afternoon, everyone. So first of all, we have to determine what a restrictive covenant is. And a restrictive covenant is a solemn agreement between a vendor and the purchaser, wherein the purchaser covenants with the vendor that he will not do certain acts in respect of the land. And the agreement has 3 characteristics. They should be negative or restrictive, meaning that the landowner is prevented from doing something. The covenant must be for the benefit of some other land, and the covenant runs with the land, which means that it binds and benefits all successive landowners and not just the persons who made the original contract. Restrictive covenants may be removed or modified from the register book of titles by an agreement between the parties having an interest in the covenant or by an order by the court of competent jurisdiction. The persons who may apply are any persons interested in any of the freehold land affected by the restriction as to the user of the land or building, or the town and country planning authority. But there are 3 grounds which are set out under the Restrictive Covenants Discharge and Modification Act, and in order, pardon me, by reason, in order, give me a moment, please. Can Mr. Senior help me out, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe if you step back a little and see the basis of how these restrictive covenants came into being, maybe it will provide some amount of insight before we look at modifying them, right? Or discharging them. Because you say, well, first of all, as was, appropriately outlined by Ms. Thomas, a restrictive covenant, you can look at it, you can break it down. First of all, it's a covenant, right? What's a covenant? It's no different from what we know a covenant should be from even biblical days. It's an agreement between parties, right? So the fact that it is restrictive is important. To be restricted means that it is negative. So it's not something to say that what you can do with your land. It's really what you should not do with your land. Okay? So that makes it a restrictive covenant. Now, it's important that for it to be restrictive, not only is it negative, but like Mr. Thomas has said, it runs with the land. So somebody ought to benefit. Now, you can have a situation where both parties benefit, right? But it doesn't have to be that way. So initially, when you had, let's say, a large holder of land, he could decide, for example, to sell, say, a lot from that large piece. And he's going to sell to John Brown, and he imposes on John Brown certain things that John Brown must not do. And why? Because he's probably going to live on that land anyway, and he doesn't want, so let's say he has a nice residential property, but he wants to sell a piece to John Brown. He may say to John Brown, he doesn't want any commercial buildings to go on the piece he's selling him. So a covenant will go on that agreement to say no commercial buildings, etc. Right? He may say no school, no shop, nothing like that. So what happens is that he may benefit from those, and he may make it such that both parties can benefit. He doesn't have to, but he can make it that the person who is selling the lot to has to abide by those restrictions. Now, if you move forward to those restrictions being imposed, and you consider now the same large piece of land and he decides not only to sell to John Brown, but sell to 5, 10 other persons. These are agreements which, if they're going to be changed, everybody has to agree to it. Now, of course, that can create a problem. Because obviously, to get everybody agreeing to all the different things, once the numbers increase in terms of larger numbers, it becomes much more difficult. And it is in that context where you have the act coming into being. So what the act does is that it allows the court to make those changes to an agreement. And as a matter, that's section 3, but also section 5 allows for one to look at whether or not those covenants are even enforced in the first place in a proper manner. So what does the court look at then when it's going to undergo this modification? And a number of things are taken into consideration. Well, the court will make the modification if it is deemed that the restriction is obsolete. And let me just simplify it like that. So it's no longer necessary to have this restriction on your title. It will also make it if it is deemed to prevent the reasonable use of the land. If the parties have agreed, they will make the modification. Or if it is deemed that if the modification is made, no injury is suffered by the persons entitled to the benefit. And so once any one of those grounds can be sufficiently put forward to the court, and the court is satisfied, then it will grant the modification or the discharge. So an application is made to the court. If any of those are made out, then the court is prepared to usually grant the modification or the discharge, for that matter. And as was mentioned before, a lot of these restrictive covenants that you see on title, some of them, for example, maybe the most common one that is done in the courts is a distance from, say, boundaries. And so if for example, a restrictive covenant say, no building shall be, we say, within 10 feet, then quite often those are modified because it can be shown that maybe no injury is done or any of the other conditions that are required to be proven to the court is actually made out. So I believe that if you look at why the restrictive covenants were put there, and you look at what the court is empowered to do, once any of those 4 criteria is met, then the court is normally prepared to modify or discharge the covenant.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Senior.
You're welcome.
So there are instances where restrictive covenants are breached in new developments, but the property is transferred to individuals without the breach being identified or discovered. Most times, these breaches are discovered when the individuals are applying for building permission or the ownership is being transferred. So, Mr. Senior, can the owners take legal action against the developers when the breach is discovered?
I think so. I think so. So like I said earlier, not too long ago, Section 5 looks at, the court looks at whether or not those restrictive covenants were enforced properly in the first place. And it looks at a couple of things. And one of them is whether or not it was part of a bill, those restrictive covenants was actually part of a building scheme. And so in that scenario, it needs to be mutual. And if in fact, it can be established that there is a building scheme, I see no reason why the owners could not take action against the developers, because your restrictive covenant runs with the land. And so even if you're not the first person who bought from the developer, you, once properly enforced, you should be able to take action against the developer.
Okay, thank you,
Thank you very
Mr.
much.
Senior. Dr. Bailey, in a general sense, could you provide us with a step-by-step explanation of the development process when planning permission has been granted and there's a confirmed development order for the locality in which the development will be? Or if it's been granted and there's no confirmed development order for the locality in which the development will be? Can't hear you, Dr. Bailey.
I think I addressed that question when I first spoke. The
They're
actual planning
asking,
process.
okay, but if you could just go over it again in a brief way.
Okay, well, first of all, NEPA has classes of developments that require different planning permissions. For example, what kind of developments require an EIA, for example? I think it has to do with lots, developments over certain lots, subdivision over certain lots, things like abattoirs, mining activities require housing products of 10 or 50 projects, hotel resorts of 12 to 50 rooms. Those things require EIA. So the EIA, once EIA is required, that's a different process than a regular single family housing that goes for approval. So for a project that may require EIA, I repeat, for a new project, NEPA screens the project. The person submits the project for screening through NEPA. So the NEPA basically screens the project. If an EIA is required, the person is furnished with a TOR from NEPA, and they submit a TOR to NEPA of how they intend to undertake the EIA. Right, the EIA is done. Person submit the EIA along with the product details. NEPA reviews the product details and the EIA. Of course, EIA also requires a lot of public consultation. If the EIA satisfies NEPA, then the product is approved, and the developer no goes. No, this is where persons undervalue NEPA's contribution, because the person that once NEPA grants the approval, then NEPA is out of the picture. That is not the case. Once NEPA grants approval, right, NEPA now goes into monitoring role. So it's not a case where NEPA says, okay, you're approved, go and do your thing. NEPA now switches mode from approval to monitoring to ensure that the product is done according to the approval conditions, right? That means there should be no breach, in any spatial breach, physical breach, or ecological breach of the product. NEPA ensure that they monitor the products carefully. If the EIA, if NEPA denies the project because the EIA is faulty, then the person can appeal to the minister. The minister, normally, if the project is of national importance, the minister is likely to approve the project. One of the things I struggle with is that even though NEPA have all these planning processes for different regions, we all know that in Jamaica, the smallest planning unit is the constituency. So it doesn't matter how NEPA has all these delineations of planning areas, everything happens at the constituency level. We can work around that. All right.
Okay. So Dr. Bailey. Oh, I'm sorry. Continue.
Outside of the products that require EIA, so somebody is doing a single family dwelling, normal development, or a bar or a commercial center or something, the person. First of all, every area in Jamaica is covered by a development order. NEPA does have development orders for all. I think there are about parishes and some other special areas, like Negro special area, South Carolina area, different, but every parish is not under development order condition. The development order basically sets out how development should be ordered on that space. And when I use the word development, I use the word development deliberately. Development means land, giving land value, basically, giving land, whether the land value is socially defined, ecologically defined, or economically defined. So once everything will fall under a development area, and they have local planning areas within development orders. So the order outlines some of the the metrics and standards that are pertinent to development in that particular space. So the performance of development has to now follow all these quantitative metrics of setbacks, densities, heights, building use, all these regulations, right? And ensure that they conform with these so they get those requirements from NEPA's Spatial Planning Division. That's where they go and get all the requirements that they need to follow. They need to abide by when they submit their approval. So at NEPA there, the Spatial Planning Branch now accepts the person's submission. They go through it. Is it conformity with all the regulations and standards in that particular area? If no, they send back to them to make adjustment. If yes, the NEPA grants approval, and they once again go into the monitoring and evaluation stage of the project.
Okay, so Dr. Bailey, could you briefly tell us how public participation is included in the EIA process?
It is a crucial part of the EIA process. In particular, those persons who will be directly impacted, directly in that space by the proposed project. Most times EIA will include, in mining areas, will include persons to be relocated. Of course, if you're going to relocate somebody, you have to understand their current and their projected proposed needs for both social and spatial resources in different locations. So a development may deprive a community of airspace, of a common area, of whatever. It may also create investment in the community that may create improvement in community. So whether the proposed development is going to create negative or positive investment, people have to be aware of how will this proposed action impact on my life and livelihood, both now and in the future. So persons, the community have to be involved. And I mean the community meaning entire Jamaica, even persons in the diaspora should be involved in voicing their concerns. Concerns mean their approval or disapproval of any development that's going to take place in the country. Even those that are proposed by parliamentarians in your constituencies should be subject to public scrutiny. Even those more than others, because we see right around Jamaica, we see a lot of buildings and things that have gone up that nobody uses them, and you wonder what informed somebody to put a public transportation center here, or a hotel there, or a school there, or a medical center there. Why? What was the reason behind that? They cannot. It can't be a fact where something as important as a major bus terminus is decided on by one person. The public are the users. They should be a part of the process of deciding how it is designed and where it's located.
Makes sense. A lot of sense. Okay, so thus far, our discussion shows that our planning regime is far from perfect, as is the case with other developing countries. Our legal framework creates and sustains an inequity that makes it difficult to enforce against informal land tenure holders. And at the same time, the limited presence of development orders means the legal guidance for development undertaken by formal land tenure holders is less than ideal. In addition, there's limited procedural guidance on planning practice. So the average citizen has incomplete information on how the planning regime works, and what is seen in the physical space often seems like disorder. In summary, it appears that what has manifested in Jamaica is a land market with two opposing equilibriums that coexist simultaneously. This raises questions about our ability to achieve sustainable development within the context of planning, because to manage two opposing outcomes or realities, one must display ambidexterity. In this upcoming segment of our session, we will explore our ability to develop sustainability with a view to coming to an understanding of how sustainability can be incorporated indigenously in our planning regime. Before posing any questions, we will share with attendees what we are referring to when we use the terms ambidexterity and sustainability. So our definition of ambidexterity is the ability to apply multiple approaches either concurrently or successively when addressing a problem, issue, or matter. When we speak of sustainability, we are referring to it in the broadest sense, which is the ability to consistently support or maintain processes over time. These definitions suggest both terms are interrelated because to meaningfully address issues such as climate change, poverty, and evolving pandemics, planners must, through collective action, utilize well-coordinated, multi-pronged, multidimensional, and flexible strategies to consistently support or maintain processes over time. So consider this, and bearing in mind the local realities and the sustainable development goals. Dr. Bailey, unpack for us why planning and development must be ambidextrous for Jamaica to achieve sustainable development.
Again, I have to go back into history, but I'm not going far back. I'm going post-war history, and look at development post the last World War, not the one going on now in Russia and Ukraine, the big World War, with Europeans. How have we come to define development post-World War? Development has come to be defined as economic growth, I would say, and market expansion, which transforms and deconstructs the natural environment and social relationships. That is how that has been the platform upon which sustainability was first crafted, well, in contemporary times crafted. At the first Rio conference in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, I can't remember when. It was a case, it was polar. On one hand, we had the rich, powerful countries who got rich and powerful by exploiting the environment and destroying the environment, saying to poor countries, look here, you can't do what we do and survive. So we have gotten rich and powerful by polluting our seas, our water bodies, our atmosphere, cutting down forests. But we don't want you to go that route. Don't follow us. We're going to help you to develop and give you loans and stuff, and you will protect the environment, and we'll keep on exploiting the environment and get rich. That was the socio-political basis for our current sustainable development goals and all that kind of thing, right? That's the fact behind it. No, what we have now is a system that concerns two people. On one hand, we have actual people, which is us. On the other hand, we have potential people, which is people who may or may not come in the future. So when I live in an environment of scarcity at all levels, I am now being told or asked or demanded or commanded to deprive myself of basic needs like clean water, clean air, basic food items, basic space. I'm now being asked to deprive myself of those basic needs that I need to make my life work, so that persons who are capitalists can exploit these things, and so persons in the future may have access to these things. I am not going to commit suicide on behalf of capitalists or on behalf of persons who may come in the future. I want to ensure that sustainability needs to be redefined along the lines of equity. Allow every country to define its development trajectory based off its own indigenous ecology and social conditions. Nobody should impose on other countries, this is how you should define your development path. Allow me to allow, for example, what are the facts of Jamaica's location? Our location makes us prone to earthquakes, hurricanes, tropical storms, tsunamis, and those things. We cannot ignore these facts. We can't ignore the fact that we are, based off our location on the Caribbean plate and North American plate, we're prone to earthquakes and hurricanes and all kinds of pestilences. We can't go around those facts. Those are the facts of our location. Those facts need to be entrenched in everything we do and say on this island of Jamaica. That is not the case now. So what we have are persons living the metropolitan lifestyle on islandic conditions, because according to the current conceptual basis of sustainability, it doesn't put a lot of emphasis on indigenous resources. And indigenous, everything is we're going to give you some policies to follow. We're going to give you some plans to follow. No, let me develop my own based off my own indigenous characteristics. And it begins again with legislations. Our legal frameworks are borrowed from continental spaces, continental space, basically. So allow me to develop my own indigenous legal base, my own indigenous land use systems, my own indigenous, and our land use systems are already defined for us by the tropical maritime rainforest, right? Where we have mixed uses in one space. Jamaica is a country of high biodiversity. That's how we should live. There shouldn't be any middle income housing scheme, low income housing scheme, and everything should be mixed up. That's the nature of our ecological reality, mixed land use. But we don't propagate that. We propagate separating the land uses on social and economic grounds, which is contrary to islandic living. That is how we define sustainability in Jamaica. It is wrong, and we have not gained any traction from how we have defined sustainability in Jamaica since it was first promulgated and put in our policies and legislations. It needs to be redefined.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Dr. Bailey. Mr. Senior and Ms. Thomas, it's for you. From your personal experiences, how is the prevalence of informality affecting development nationally?
Ms. Thomas, you want to go first? So, all right. So,
Go ahead, Council. Go ahead.
What was the question, Sadiki? Sadiki, what was the question?
The question was, from their personal experiences, how is the prevalence of informality affecting development nationally?
Okay.
Let me put it this way. I have a very handsome, very handsome transaction in the making. You know, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know where it's going to lead to. Very early stages. On that piece of land, you know, and without giving away too much, there's much to enjoy from that piece of land. The water is right there, you know, and all that good stuff. And part of the challenge is that the potential purchaser is being asked to, you know, find their own ways of getting off those persons who are on that land. Now, the potential investor, he's looking at how he can maximize on his money from day one. It will be a big investment for the country, but then he has to decide, do I want to take on this informal arrangement in terms of the settlement of persons who he has to now find his ways of getting them off, and weigh that against, could I make my investment somewhere else where I don't have to put up with those kind of things? So if you're asking how it affects national development, how it affects how we grow as a country, I think we have to look at, you know, we probably have, let me tell you something. They say even for a family member, it's better you charge a family member $1 per month, per year, than to allow them on the property undisturbed for a protracted period. Because unfortunately, people do some evil things. And it does affect the growth and development of the country. So these persons who are on this piece of land, were they not to be on the land, you could see Well, one, you'd see council much happier, and two, you would see a possible development in our country that many communities could benefit from. So I think I'll just leave it at that example.
Ms.
And
Thomas,
to
do you want to add?
Yes, to add to that, the informality, it affects owners in accessing loans. So where a mortgage institution or a bank would accept a title as collateral for a loan, if a person doesn't have a formal title in hand, then that would put them at a disadvantage.
Thank you, Ms. Thomas and Mr. Senior. We are often advised to model planning and development on the Sustainable Development Goals, but in one's opinion, there are difficulties when trying to adopt the Social Development Goals because they together create a planning framework that has nothing uniquely Jamaican about it. Thus, it lacks context. And I think Dr. Billy has touched on this a little bit. For planning to work effectively, it must be situated at the intersection of legal, theoretical, and practical frameworks that's grounded in equity and actively encourages the incorporation of the public's voice. From this perspective, Jamaica's legal and procedural planning frameworks require institutional change and a shift in our understanding and application of town and country planning at the national level. In the association's view, the crux of indigeneity is a deep understanding of the local realities and the ability to have policies shaped by that understanding, procedural theories of planning, and theoretical positions on planning phenomena. I'm sure the chat was buzzing with a lot of questions and probably still is buzzing with a lot of questions, and this will lead us to our question and answer segment. So this is the first question, please. So a question that was posted in the chat: from the definition of restrictive covenants, aren't many of the restrictive covenants now being attached to titles in requiring an action on the part of the landowner incorrectly placed on title? And this question was posted by Mr. Johnson. Does any one of the panelists want to answer this question?
Well, Section 5, if I may, does speak to, does empower the court to look at how whether the restricted covenants were properly enforced in the first place. So it's really, I believe, a matter for the court to determine. Remember now, so I said earlier that the thing about a restrictive covenant, as opposed to just a covenant, is that the restrictive covenant needs to be negative, right? And you have pointed it, are restrictive, as I've mentioned there. So if you're asking, are they, the way they're attached to titles, is it incorrectly placed? Well, once a covenant is properly worded, once it is negative, once it's run with the land, then typically that restrictive covenant would be, properly endorsed on the title. But again, it doesn't stop there. It has to be looked at in a wholesome way, and it's a matter for the court to determine that.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Senior. Okay, could you give an example of such a positive covenant? Could that be the reason the title says encumbrances and not restrictive covenants?
So let us move away from the word covenant and use agreement, because that's what a covenant is, right? An agreement between parties. Anything that you do per the agreement is not a restrictive covenant. A restrictive covenant does the opposite. It tells you what you're not to do. So remember, an agreement, I can agree with you to pay you $10. That's not a restrictive covenant because I'm doing something. Yes, as it concerns land, you take a look at those restrictive covenants, and what you will see, it is no building shall be, no gates shall not be, that kind of language, that negative language, right? So the other side is, once it's something positive, which can be in a typical agreement, a restrictive covenant would be almost the opposite, tell you what you cannot do.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Senior.
All right, so next question. Okay. Next question is posed by Ms. Higgins. What if a retrofitted container is used as a building? Will it be treated as buildings, for example, those made from block and steel, when determining whether there is a building built? And should building approval be sought? Anyone like to say that?
The building approval doesn't so much approve the building, meaning the design, as it does how the building is placed on the land. So for example, NEPA can say to you have to use slab roof, or you have to use French windows, or you have to have a kitchen there. It can't tell you how you should design your building. That is your prerogative. It just tells you how the building should be fitted onto the land, and maybe the height of the building, which can also be a design thing. But it tells how the land should be fitted onto the building. So yes, a container house, a container home is now a building, and it has regulations. For example, the building code does address how container homes are used, because they have structural concerns of how persons will start them up. And we have many houses in Jamaica that are built with containers, but the building code covers that also.
Okay, we'll go ahead and take Mr. Earl Spencer's question. And to ask you to unmute, Mr. Spencer.
Good afternoon,
Good afternoon.
fellow participants. We have heard, I did not come in at the very beginning, but I heard inference that covenants are between, say, vendor and purchaser. That is true, but the vendor and purchaser don't have the last say. They can decide this won't be on a condition of my selling you the property, because eventually it's the local authority who is making it, especially for a big subdivision. My real question is, who is my neighbor? We don't think that, I mean, most people think it's the people just nearby, but it is generally understood that it's everybody in the particular subdivision. And I don't see where that has been addressed in general, not by the panelists, but I mean, it's not being practiced. They require you to serve notices on the people and to get responses, and they don't spread it far enough, because some people may think, well, I'm on 2 avenues above, and that doesn't trouble me, and yet they are part of the decision making. So I'm saying that when these covenants are being placed, it is true that to some extent the developer has some say in it, but naturally it would be skewed in his favor if he were allowed to just put covenants and so on. or to have some of them discharged. So I'm just wondering how you folks view it in the general application of applying for modification or discharging covenants.
If I may, that's a very interesting perspective, Earl Spencer. One of the concerns now with an urbanizing Jamaica is how do you translate the rural definition of community and neighborhood into the urban space? Because in urban space where NEPA has outlined local development areas, local areas for development and all those formal legal delineations, persons' social boundaries do not follow NEPA's and the KCMC's legal planning boundaries. So many times, what persons consider their neighborhood/community conflicts with NEPA's delineation of what is the neighborhood and the community. That is so because we haven't been able to translate our rural habits and translate them into urban habits over the years. So what we have now is that at the structural level, when a land surveyor does a particular survey in a community, all the lands are on a common, what we call DP, a depositors plan. So it's a common line, what we call it now in mathematics, maybe a line of best fit, where all the lots are tagged onto that common line. And that in many cases is considered a community because all the persons have that common line that they all use. So you might find
same covenants.
yes, so exactly. So you might find persons on that DP having the same covenant conditions, which can translate into them being a community. But that's more, well, paralegal. But even within that same DP, you'll find that if there are two sets of generations in the community, one set may say, we're a community because we're all between 35 and 50. And then the older ones who were there before them saying, well, that's our community because we're here we're all in our 80s. So the whole community concept, as we have been able to translate it into quantitative metrics to suit planning processes. It is going to happen eventually because as we more formalize our space uses, let me go back in a while. And this problem of community only exists inside the formal planning areas. In these informal settlements, the community is well defined. And they all agree on the community and they can defend it. It's only inside areas that lack the social cohesion as they do in the informal areas that the whole neighborhood community thing is giving them headache to figure out where is their community. When you go in informal spaces, people know exactly this is where I start over there. There's a different thing, and you wonder, but minutes online that I don't see any physical evidence of a difference, but they know where the communities are. It is not so in the more formalized spaces. So maybe we now need to design in these communities some commonalities that persons can identify and say, okay, this is my community. This is the way we should use going forward.
Okay, thank you, Dr.
Thank
Bailey.
you.
I just want to bring it to everyone's attention that we're actually at 4:30 and we're apologizing for going over the time. We'd like to do 3 more questions if it's okay with everyone, and then we'll close. So this question was sent by Mr. Dell. Could we still get a description of how the in-court process, to modify or discharge a restrictive covenant is done?
I'll ask Mr. Dell or Nicholas. So I'll ask Dell to reach out to me afterwards for that detail. But I mean, very, very briefly, so we draft our document, we submit them to a parish council. If there's say we want to change, I refer to covenant that say they shouldn't build more than say 5 feet, but the building is say 4 feet to the boundary, then we submit a building plan. The parish council either objects or doesn't. NEPA either objects or doesn't. We file that in court. We have a first hearing. We probably have another at least one more hearing and then a final hearing. So you're gonna have advertisement taking place during that time. But in a nutshell, it's really submitting a copy of the title, submitting paying the necessary fees, of course, getting the parish council approval, getting NEPA's approval, going to the court, getting the orders of the court, complying with the orders of the court, advertising, and then have a final hearing. When all is said and done, the modification is made on the title or whatever it is, whether it's a modification or a discharge made on the title at the title's office. In a tight nutshell, but clearly there is a little bit more involved in the process.
Thank you, Mr. Senior.
You're welcome.
The next question posed by Mr. Hibbert. What steps are there to be taken when a plot of land owned by an individual is being overtaken by informal settlement? If someone could briefly answer that question.
Just to be real quick, it always requires more detail. What our law says is that we have an interest in land, yes? And so if you leave your land without expressing or having that interest in it for a period of 12 years or more, then it's pretty much no longer your land. And that brings into the whole conversation adverse possession. So that happens to a number of persons who especially go overseas. They leave their property, 12 years pass, they come back, they find somebody else in the property, and it's no longer theirs according to law, because their interest has been acted on adverse to them. And it happens whether it's a house or just a piece of land, as I think it's been alluded to here. Same thing. If someone is on your land for more than 12 years, they have demonstrated to the world that it's their land, so they have bushed it while you weren't here, assuming you weren't here. They have fenced around, they have do little farming, they have shown that they're showing to the world that they are in fact taking possession of this land. You are not in the country or showing an interest in that land for a period of 12 years or more, and the law says that it's no longer your land. So if that period has not expired, of course you can take steps to get them off. You have a notice being served and start court proceedings if they don't respond to the notice. But you've got to be mindful that you have to show an interest in land. That's what you have. If you do not show that interest can be pretty much taken. Someone else can act adverse to your interest. Let me put it that way.
Thank you, Mr. Senior.
Right, we now will take Mr. William Ashton's question, and this will be the last question for our question and answer session. Go ahead, Mr. Ashton.
Okay, thanks. My colleagues and panel, good evening. If in a subdivision we are noticing that the covenants have to be modified in a high percentage, and by looking at it practically, we have noticed that the covenants are like subduing the developments because of the lot sizes or whatever. And the restrictions, can there be a way for them to overall have all of the titles modified, or is it that everyone will have to be going to do an individual application?
I think it's best. I think it's best that it always comes down to what the facts are, but it could be that the entire thing has to be done over. You may want to, consider a class action, but it depends on the gravity of the situation. it's probably best that everything start be done over, because everybody's been affected. That could be problematic.
I think it is
It's not like a one or
also,
two situation, one-off situation from what I'm hearing. You're saying, Mr. Bailey, you're saying?
I think it's also the developer's responsibility to ensure that the covenants in development are different from what it was before it became that new use. Developers have to ensure that their covenants match the social and spatial conditions they are proposing in that space. So it should be a blanket situation.
I've seen this in a few places, not many, but weird, and it affects us a large number of people as well. So you know, I just had that concern as a surveyor. To say, I noticed I've been doing breaches, you know, so often in certain areas.
The developers have to ensure, because you can't be doing 200 houses in a development, and everybody have their own thing going on. The developer has to ensure that there's a common covenant that covers the entire space before persons start to buy their units. You see, we always, you see, in the urban space, we think about buying a house, but we don't think about that. We're also buying land. We say, "I want a house and I want a house," but it's not. We also buy the house and the land, and the house and land have two different legislations that govern the way they are used.
All right, Chief. I hope to visit you at some time. That's the beauty. Come on. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so I think we've come to the end of our program, and it's my pleasure at this time to just thank all those who have participated, in particular our panelists, Ms. Denise Thomas, Mr. Winston Sr., and Dr. Earl Bailey. And also to thank those who attended and participated in our program. You know, we do these events, well, every month, and we appreciate the questions and the participation from our attendees. I'd also like to thank our moderators, Ms. Candice O'Brien and Mr. Sadiki Hines. And last but not least, I'd like to thank Alev's council members, Mr. Jermaine Williamson, Dr. Tina Beal, Mrs. Rochelle Channa Miller, among others. And I hope that we'll all be able to be a part of our next discussion. And I invite you all to keep your eyes and your ears open for our next topic. Thank you very much.
Okay, so it is clear that there are inequities in our planning regime. It's also clear that for us to develop sustainability, legislative changes will be needed to change the current path of our institution. The lesson to be drawn from our roundtable today is that to see the changes that are needed, we must first start with us as individuals, so that the Jamaica of today will be much improved in the future. A Jamaica which lives up to the mantra of Vision 2030, advancing the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, leaving no one behind. We hope you have enjoyed the session, and we look forward to inviting you to our next webinar. Be safe and God bless.
God bless.
So while these persons are leaving, for our attendees to note that they're to look out for constitution. Also for members in the RICS conference on between October 13th and 14th was hall, as well next event, which November, where it's looking at the environment. Additional details, and you'll see information on our social media platforms. Thank you, everyone, and have a good evening.